Hello everyone, my name is David Fields and today I'll be talking to you about Teamwork Cloud or Collaboration Studio tips and best practices. Before we dive in, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm one of the founders and the Chief Technology Officer of Enola Technologies. I have over 10 years of MBSE and digital engineering experience, primarily at NavAir as a federal employee where I was part of the System Engineering Transformation Initiative and stood up and ran the Naval IME, the Navy's MBSE environment, for about 3 years. After that, I went on to support the Army PEO Aviation's FLORA program as the DE lead before finally starting Enola Technologies with my partners. My specialties include Teamwork Cloud and environment deployments, automation such as macro scripts and plugins, profiling and domain-specific language, report generation and custom validation suites, but I can pretty much cover all the different areas of MBSE when needed. And today we're going to talk about some of the tips and best practices in a few critical areas of Teamwork Cloud. First off, I'll give you a little overview of Teamwork Cloud and Collaboration Studio. Then we'll talk about installation and configuration, though I won't spend a lot of time in that area. We'll also talk about some tips with security and access. I'll talk a little bit about user groups and how you can really use them to your advantage. Then we'll talk a little bit about model libraries and things to start thinking about if you're going to plan for having libraries in your Teamwork Cloud. And then we'll wrap up with a little bit on metrics and automation. Now, please be aware, this brief focuses just on the tips and best practices, not basic usage and installation that can be found in the documentation. There's one little exception to that, but for the most part, I didn't want to regurgitate what's already in the No Magic or Dassault documentation. So most of these slides will be just a few bullet points on critical tips that I think you need to know. Now, what is Teamwork Cloud or Collaboration Studio? Well, it's a server-based model repository for the No Magic or CATIA Magic client applications. Models are uploaded to Teamwork Cloud from the client application and allow for role-based access, such as read, write, and manage, and also support multiple authentication methods. Simultaneous collaboration via locking and unlocking elements, very similar to Subversion or Git, if you think from software development. It also has element level versioning, branches, allow you to merge and branch off different parts of your model, and web-based administration. Now, the Dassault CATIA version of Teamwork Cloud is called Collaboration Studio, and it's actually a bundle of both Teamwork Cloud and another product that allows for web-based access of models called Cameo Collaborator. Most of the Cameo Collaborator code, documentation, and images still refer to the No Magic products, and so you'll hear me just say Teamwork Cloud for the remaining part of this brief, but you can take any time I say Teamwork Cloud and replace it with Collaboration Studio since they are essentially the same product. Now, let's talk about installation and configuration. The number one tip I can give you is always add extra time in the plan for the initial installation of Teamwork Cloud. It is a great product with lots of amazing capabilities, and they keep adding more every version. But it can take time to get installed and working depending on your setup and your environment. If you're going to be doing a very large scale deployment with multiple nodes and multiple servers, it's going to take a little time to work out all the kinks and get it working right. So always add a little extra time for the initial installation. Now that's out of the way. My big number one tip for installation for you is to not stand up just a single Teamwork Cloud server. I can't tell you how many organizations and companies I go into where this is the case. You need to have at least two, development and production. Now, if you want to add testing servers, QA servers, and other common things you'll see in other software and server-based environments, you're absolutely welcome to. But at the very minimum, you need development and production servers. Now, be aware, the development server or any other additional servers will require additional license, but thankfully, you may not need as robust of a license as you need for your production server. And what I mean by that is if your production server needs to support 100 Teamwork Cloud users, you're going to have the proper licenses to support, so many concurrent connections to support that user base. But on your development and like your testing and QA servers, you typically aren't going to have that many concurrent users because this is usually for a small set of admins or power users that are going to be testing or upgrading. So you can typically get by with much smaller licenses for these servers. Now, one of the reasons you need a development server is most organizations' IT policies require it or recommend it, But it's also great for testing and testing all sorts of different things. Upgrades, either the upgrade to Teamwork Cloud itself to maybe a new major version or a service pack or refresh, but also, testing patches to the operating system itself. Maybe you're going to deploy a new Java or upgrade the kernel on your Linux server. It's a great place to do it on your test server or development server prior to do it on production. And later on, we'll talk a little bit about automations, but it's a great place to test automations. Trust me, I accidentally broke our test Teamwork Cloud at NavAir a couple times testing some automations. That's why I always do it on the development or test server first prior to running it on production. Also great for testing integrations. There are some third-party applications out there that integrate with Teamwork Cloud. Things like OSLC. A lot of times it's great to go and test those in a non-production server and work out the kinks before trying it on your actual live data. It's also a great place to test new features. As I mentioned earlier, they're always adding new features to Teamwork Cloud, both in major releases and in the refreshes, but sometimes those can have a pretty big impact on how your models work or how Teamwork Cloud works, like the new data marking in Teamwork Cloud in 2022X. It's a good idea to test that on a development server so you understand how it works and what issues you might run into prior to running it on production. And the final tip I have for you on installation and configuration is back up the Cassandra database. Again, this is something I have to tell organizations a lot more than I thought I would have to. But a good practice is to back it up nightly and maybe even add to that a weekly backup to an offsite location. That's something that we did in the Navy. It was pretty standard practice, but it is critical to have good backups of your Cassandra database. And so now that I know you're going to have both at least a production and development server, if something were to happen to your production server and you had a nightly backup, a lot of organizations have processes in place to be able to flip the development server into the production server, restore the data from last night's backup, and you're up and running again while you figure out what happened with your production server. It is also possible to do incremental backups. It is not something I believe that's supported out of the box, but there are some organizations out there that I know that are doing that and have some automation to do incremental backups, so you're not having to back up a large Cassandra database all at once. But even if you're all having to do it in one fell swoop, it's still highly recommended to back up often, at least nightly if you can, on large-scale enterprise deployments. Now, security. I could make probably a whole brief on the security side of Teamwork Cloud, but there are a few things that I really want to focus on. And the first one being the one exception to I'm not going to be telling you what the documentation tells you, but there is a page in the Teamwork Cloud documentation called Hardening Teamwork Cloud, and I highly recommend that you go take a look at it. And then once you've got your initial Teamwork Cloud installed and working, it's a good idea to go back and review it again and see what you can do to harden your Teamwork Cloud. It covers things from being able to close off certain ports or change ports to data at rest encryption to configuring the Tomcat server that runs that's the web server that runs the administration page, and much more. It even includes some shell scripts for Linux boxes that allow you to easily implement some of these practices without having to do a lot of manual work. So highly recommend that everybody deploying Teamwork Cloud take a good look at that Hardening Teamwork Cloud page of the documentation. Second on security is you need to periodically review who has access to your projects. And this can either be done from a project manager standpoint and an administrator standpoint. And thankfully, there are some things built into the tool now to make this a little easier. One is the security audit report that you can run when you're looking at a resource in the resource application of TWAdmin. You can click on the three dots and click Generate Security Audit Report. However, only an administrator can do that at this time, which is one of my big complaints. Users, even the resource managers, can't run that report. So you'll have to ask your admin, but it's quick and simple, and it just generates a little Excel table that shows you who all has access to your model, what role they have, when they were granted the access, and by who. So it's a good thing to run periodically just to keep an eye on who has access to your model. Maybe someone's left your team or project and they no longer need access to it. It might be a good way to catch that and go ahead and remove their access. And speaking of access, you've got to monitor global scoped role assignment. So in Teamwork Cloud, you can assign several of the roles in 3 different scopes now. either at the resource level, so I grant a user read access to a model. At category level, let's say I give a user read access to every model in a particular category, or global, which means I would grant users read access to every model in Teamwork Cloud. And that latter is where the problem lies. Now, I do know some organizations and have some customers that want global read access for all users, and that's great if that's how you want to set yours up. But most situations I've been in, especially in the defense, or even in some larger companies that have multiple, high-profile projects, having someone have global access to everything is a big no-no. And unfortunately, with the way Teamwork Cloud works today, a admin or a resource manager could accidentally grant a user global read or write access. And it does happen. It's happened on my Teamwork Clouds. Thankfully, I keep an eye on this, so I caught it. But when you go add a new role to a user from the user application perspective of TW admin, when you add that new role, such as resource reviewer, as you see on the image here, the default scope is global. And I've had people accidentally say, oh, I got a resource reviewer, great, save. Not realizing they had to go change that global scope to either a category or a specific resource before saving. And the fact that it's default to global scope means it's pretty easy to accidentally save that and give someone global access. Now, one way to prevent that is to teach people not to manage access through the user application and to do it from the resource application. And therefore, you're less likely, or you actually have to put a little work into it to grant someone global access. And continuing on with access management, you need to decide fairly early on, if possible, how you want to manage access to the resources in Teamwork Cloud. And there are three common approaches. The admin level, which you have either the Teamwork Cloud admin or some group of admin-like users that manage all role assignments in the Teamwork Cloud. And I have a couple customers that do this. And it kind of allows for a single person or a small group of people to manage and monitor all the access. And therefore, users can focus more on the modeling instead of Teamwork Cloud resource management, which is a common complaint I've got from some users, that they spend so much time granting and removing people access that they can't do some of their day job. Now, the downside to this is it can be cumbersome for some users to have to wait on admins to grant access, especially if there's not a really established process in place. I've seen one organization where you just email a group inbox for a bunch of admins and say, hey, can you grant me access to Project X? And whenever they get to it, they'll grant you access. That also can put extra strain on the admins themselves, particularly if these admins are traditional system admins that are managing more than just your Teamwork Cloud. That's a lot of extra work to have to be constantly granting access or removing access from projects. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about going down this route. It can work very well for small Teamwork Clouds and small organizations, but at large organizations and large deployments, typically not a good approach. The second, probably the most common one, the one I like the most, is the project level access, where resource access is handled completely by the resource managers of each resource or model. So for those that don't know, when you upload a model to Teamwork Cloud, which you have to be granted access to do, as soon as you upload that model, you're automatically granted what's called the resource manager role of that model. And it's kind of like the overarching admin of that model. You can add and remove users. You can change things about the model, add project usages. And so a lot of organizations will push down the responsibility of managing access to those types of users. Sorry, I could not cough. Now, the downside to doing project level access is it requires all your resource managers to understand how to add and remove users from a resource. And I found a lot of organizations stand up a Teamwork Cloud, but don't really arm their users with the knowledge of how to do this. Yes, it's very well laid out in the documentation page, but without that, I've seen a lot of users say, well, someone wants me to add on this project, but I really don't know how. So you've got to make sure your resource managers know how to do that. The other downside to project level access is it can be difficult for users to know who they need to contact to gain access to a particular model. And this is something I ran into quite a bit on the Navy environments. We had a lot of models, over 1,000 before I left. And someone might see a model on there, and I'm just going to pick like a Link 16 model, and they'll see it and not know who to ask to get access, so they'll reach out to me or my team and say, oh, I'd like access to the Link 16 model. Who do I contact? And so we would have to go dig through and look in TW admin and try to figure out who at least uploaded it, see if they were still around, and then try to contact them on behalf of the user. And that was fine, but it did add a little bit of strain to my team. The final method, common method for, sorry, the final approach to access management is the category level. So where resource access is handled at the category level by one or more category admins. And this allows, again, a single person or a group to manage and monitor access at a particular category. And this is great if you have your Teamwork Cloud organized by business units or large project areas, and then you could assign one or more people at the category level to say, you're the one that's going to be granting and removing people from these models. You're that single point of access. And I've got a couple of customers that are doing this in their Teamwork Clouds, and it works quite well. And the nice thing about it is these category level admins are typically part of the project or business unit they're managing, and therefore they understand the projects themselves and the people and who should or should not have access. But it only works on 2021 or newer. We do have a lot of folks, especially in the Department of Defense, that are still on version 19 that does not have category level permissions, so this is not an option for them. I've also seen that it can put a little additional strain on these category managers if they have other duties that are taking up a large portion of their time. So something to keep in mind when you're trying to decide which of these approaches you think would be best for your particular deployment. So now we'll talk a little bit about user groups. So user groups allow you to easily, Now let's talk about user groups. A user group allows you to easily configure role assignments for all members of the group because it basically acts like a user from a role assignment perspective. It was introduced in version 19, and it can be synced or created through it by syncing or connecting with an LDAP server, which is a very common use case of it. But you need to keep in mind that it requires admin privileges, in particular the user manager role, to create or modify user groups. And this is one of the biggest complaints I've had about user groups since it first came out, is I being an admin of a Teamwork Cloud, any group that someone wants, I have to go create for them. And anytime they want to add or remove people from them, I have to do that, or some other admin. So while they are very good, they are a little limited right now because of that admin privilege requirement to create and modify them. Hopefully one day in the future, DSO will give us like a group management role that you could assign to a group that will allow that person to manage it outside the admin team. But until then, there are still some good uses for Teamwork Cloud groups, even if you don't use them for different projects. At the very least, I highly recommend you create an all Teamwork Cloud users group. Now, it doesn't have to be called all Teamwork Cloud users. You can call it whatever you want. I've seen all users, TWC users, company X users, whatever you want to call it. The concept is still the same, and it's supposed to contain every Teamwork Cloud user. And what this allows for is to provide an easy mechanism to grant global access to resource and categories without having to use the category level permissions or some of the global access roles. Now, category level permissions have made this, I'm not going to say less needed, but you can do a lot more with category level permissions now that might allow you not to have this group, but I still highly recommend it because it can be very useful. And to give you a little example here, say you wanted to make sure that all your Teamwork Cloud users have read access to all the models in the example category and write access to all the models in the sandbox category. Now, you could absolutely do that with category level permissions. And in this case, if that was your only needs, that might be a better approach. But when you have individual models you need to give global access to, then this really shines. But back to the example, what you would do is just create that all Teamwork Cloud users group and add all your users to it. And then anytime you wanted to give all Teamwork Cloud users access to something, you would just assign that group to that role. So in our example, we would assign the group to the resource reviewer role for the examples category and assign the group to the resource contributor role for the sandbox category. And then you got to make sure that all future Teamwork Cloud users get added to that all Teamwork Cloud users group when their accounts are created, and you will easily have global access to libraries, sandboxes, and things like that. So I highly recommend trying to take advantage of this. I pretty much implement it in pretty much any Teamwork Cloud I can get my hands on because it is a big time saver and is a very useful capability. Now I want to talk a little bit about model libraries. And first and foremost, I'm going to define for this presentation a model library or library model as just being a model that is intended to be used by one or more other models as a project usage. And these are typically used by across multiple models in different projects, organizations, business units, etc. And some examples would be maybe like a common acronym library, or maybe a common component or constraint library. Maybe you have a common requirements library that a lot of projects use. Any library or any model that's going to be used by multiple other projects. And there's two areas you really need to start thinking about when you want to start planning for libraries in Teamwork Cloud. First is access and organization. And second is notification and feedback. And the second one is the one that most people forget about or don't think about. But let's take a look at access and organization first. The big takeaway here is keep your library models organized and easy to find. That's pretty common sense, but you'd be surprised at things I've seen in Teamwork Clouds. So your public libraries, or those libraries or those models are going to be used across multiple projects, teams, organizations, should be placed in the highest level category possible. I'm not saying it has to be at a root level, but keep them high up so they're easy to find. They're not buried several categories deep. And the category name should indicate that it contains, model libraries. So having common libraries as a category name is a pretty standard approach. Also, keep your non-library models out of that category. I like to see where there's just library reusable models in that category so it's easy to distinguish between library models and non-library models. And then finally, give your library models, and all models for that matter, a good name and description. And the description for Teamwork Cloud models is something a lot of people forget about because you have to go into the TWAdmin, the web administration page, to go add that description after you've uploaded it. So a lot of people forget about it, but it's a good place to add a brief description of a library model, maybe even include the point of contact, maybe an email address or something for whoever manages that model. You can put that in description. It can help your users quite a bit. Now, the second thing to be aware of is you have to make sure everyone who needs access to the model has access. Now, it seems, again, pretty self-explanatory, but a lot of people run into problems with this. Now, first off, users of the model library typically need just read access, or resource contributor role to be specific. Most of the time, your libraries, you're not going to have folks with write access unless they're the ones that are actually managing and maintaining the library. But ensuring everyone has access to all the libraries can be difficult at times. That's why I like using that all Teamwork Cloud users group. Because the lack of read access to project usages causes a lot of common problems that people run into. And to give you a little example of this is something I've seen several times over the years, probably even the first week I had the Teamwork Cloud up for the Navy, is I had a user come up to me and say, hey, I was trying to save my model offline, off Teamwork Cloud, so I could deliver it to a customer. But every time I try to save it offline, it's telling me I don't have the right permissions, even though I'm the resource manager of this model. Well, after a little digging, we come to find out that yes, he was the resource manager of that model. Yes, he had read access to all the direct project usages that model used, but there was what's called indirect project usages, or used projects of one of your used projects that he did not have read access to, that was causing the problems. We had to go back to the owner of that library and have them give him read access to all of that library's used projects before he could save it off. And that's something that's hard to kind of predict, but teaching people early to be real conscious about who has access, especially when they're making libraries, is very important, or else you'll run into problems with saving offline or being able to do other things because there's some indirect or even direct project usage you may not have read access to. Now let's talk about the notification and feedback side of model libraries. These library models will likely change over time, and users will need to be notified when a new version is released. And this can be done multiple ways. I've seen organizations do it where they might have a wiki or a knowledge base or some mass email they send out when a library is updated. And that's great, and I highly recommend doing that along with other options. But even without that, the very least you should do is to use the Magic Draw project usage options that are built into the tool when you add a new project usage to your Teamwork Cloud project. And I've got a little image of this over here on the right, where I'm adding a new project usage, in this case an Enola Tech acronym library. And if you look down at the very bottom above the buttons, there is a little checkbox that says Notify On, and then there's a combo box that says New Tag Versions. Now, there's two options in that little combo box. One is Notify on any new version, and if that's the default, and if that's selected, what happens is anytime someone makes a commit to this library, and you open up your model that's using it, you're going to get a little notification down the bottom saying the project's been updated. And in some cases, that's perfect. But I like the new tag version option because it allows me to only be notified if certain tags were put into the commit on the library project. In particular, I like to make sure that anytime I do a major or minor release of a model, I put a major tag or a minor tag in there. And with this new tag version option, you can specify which tags to be notified about. So maybe you want to go in there and say, only notify me when there's a major release. Once you set that up, the owners of this library can keep making changes over and over again, and you'll only get notified if they tag one as a major release. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, why don't they just do the library development in a branch and then merge it down to the trunk once it's a major release? And that would obviously be the best approach. But even then, still having the major and minor release tags can still be useful. But this is something you have to kind of start teaching people and make part of your standard process for versioning Teamwork Cloud models and making commits and adding project usages. So highly recommend documenting this, making this part of your knowledge base or your developer's guide or however you want to do it. But get the word out. Get people to start implementing this, and you'd be surprised how helpful this can be when dealing with model libraries. And the final part is feedback, and something that most folks I find overlook when they're talking about libraries is provide some way for users to submit feedback on library models. And this can be very formal, like we did at NavAir, where we had a service desk ticket set up where you could provide feedback for some of our high-level libraries. Or it can be very informal, where you just tell people to email the library owner, though they will need to know who the library owner is. So that can either be done in something like a catalog or maybe in that description we talked about earlier. But speaking of catalog, bonus points for anybody who actually develops a model catalog of all their library models. And it is done. It's something we were working on NavAir before I left, and I've seen other organizations do it. And it can be hosted on a wiki or a web page like Confluence or SharePoint, or it can just be a downloadable reference guide that lists all the libraries in your Teamwork Cloud. And it should include information such as the language, is it a SysML or UML model? Does it have any frameworks like UAF, UPDM, DODAF? What version was it created in? Who's the point of contact? Definitely something to consider when you start having large enterprise, collections of libraries, some way for users to discover and understand what these libraries are and who to reach out to if they have questions, feedback, or issues. The final thing I want to talk to you about is metrics and automation. I'm surprised that a lot of folks don't realize that Teamwork Cloud has a very robust REST API that provides methods for both model and server management. Now, I'll be honest, I haven't used the model management and manipulation REST API calls very much. I've primarily just used them on the server side to do exactly what I'm describing here, is gather metrics and perform automations. So first, let's talk about metrics. With a few simple REST API calls, I can get quite a bit of data about my Teamwork Cloud. For example, with one call, I can get all the users and their details. And those details include the attributes like phone number, department, name, but also include stuff like when they were created, what roles are assigned to them, what groups they're assigned to, when they last logged in. And we can get similar details on all the resources or models as well with a single call. And then if you want to get more detail, say on resources, for each one of the resources, you can run another call that gets you all the commit information. So you can see the details on every commit made to that particular resource. This allows you to do stuff to see about like average number of commits, or how many commits overall were done in the last 24 hours, or maybe on this project in the last 6 months. You can also get information on those role assignments and start understanding how are role assignments being used in your Teamwork Cloud. Are they primarily at the resource level, or are they taking advantage of the category level permissions? And the best way to really take advantage of all this data is to connect it to a business intelligence tool or something similar. Power BI by Microsoft, Tableau, ClickSense, which is what I used at NavAir, all work, basically the same in this regard. And they can provide insight into growth and usage of your environment. I like to use them to monitor for old and unused resources. So if I see there's a model up there that hasn't been, updated or changed in a year, I got to go ask myself, is it still a valid model? Could I get it out of Teamwork Cloud? Maybe I want to reach out to whoever uploaded or manages it and see if it's still in use. It may be, but it may not. It might be a good opportunity to do a little house cleaning. Make smarter purchasing decisions, especially when you combine your Teamwork Cloud metrics with like your floating license usage metrics for the client application. This is actually how I got into BI and into doing Teamwork Cloud metrics. Was in the Navy, I needed to start understanding how my environments were being used so I can make smarter purchasing decisions with licenses and understand what different business units and groups were using it more than others. And then finally, one of the things that we talked about a little early on was keeping an eye on those global access role assignments, where someone might have accidentally assigned someone global read or write access. I typically do that through the REST API, either as part of my report in like Tableau, or I may have a separate little script that just runs and reports back anybody who happens to have global resource reviewer, contributor, or manager roles, so I can be sure to go take care of that. And on the flip side of the REST API, another good use for it is automation. And so I've got a couple examples I want to talk about here about how I have either used the REST APIs to do automation or seen other folks use it. One of the first ones, and a common one that I've done, is disable accounts that haven't been logged in a specific period. And this is a pretty common practice in IT systems. If you haven't logged into your account in 60 days, it's going to be disabled. Well, Teamwork Cloud doesn't really have anything built in to do that, especially in the older versions. And so writing a little PowerShell script or shell script or some other method that will just make a call, get all the users, check for anybody whose last login date was greater than 60 days, and then go disable them with another call is pretty straightforward and very useful. Of course, you can then automate that to run nightly or weekly or however you need it to run. But once it's set up, the automation can be done and it's less required work for your admins. In a similar kind of vein, verify and update user group members. I've done this from the very beginning because I like using that all Teamwork Cloud user group, but it's easy to accidentally forget to add a new user to it. So typically weekly when I would update my Teamwork Cloud metrics, I would run something that would go find all the users and to make sure that they were in the all Teamwork Cloud user group. And if they weren't, it would automatically add them through a REST API call. And then the final one is something that one of my customers is doing now, and I thought they were crazy when they first told me, but after seeing it in action, I'm quite impressed with it. But they manage all their Teamwork Cloud user access from within a SysML model. They have a REST API call and a macro or maybe an opaque behavior inside their model that reaches out to Teamwork Cloud and pulls down all the users, all the role assignments, all the resources, and all the roles. And then they have a bunch of matrices, SysML, just matrices that show users and roles and different things, and they can use those matrices to make changes to role assignments. And when they're done, they run another operation and it reaches back out to Teamwork Cloud and updates all the access assignments automatically. So there's a lot you can do with this REST API. Now, my final slide I'll show you real quick is just a quick example of a really simple metric report I did in Microsoft Power BI for my little dummy Teamwork Cloud I have here on my local machine. But it just shows you some of the information you can get out of the REST API. On the left image is more focused on commits. I can see this Teamwork Cloud has a total of 84 commits, 6 in the last 24 hours, and averaging 17 commits per day. I can even see who's made the most number of commits, who's made the most number, created the most number of resources. The other one in the bottom right shows more role assignments. I can see who has the most role assignments and even by their scope. And yes, my Teamwork Cloud is filled with a bunch of King of the Hill characters, but I can see Hank Hill has 34 total role assignments. 6 of them are through the category assignment, 27 directly to resources, and I bet the one global is the resource creator, which is a global role anyways. So there's a lot of useful information you can get out of these REST APIs. So I highly recommend looking into it. And with that, is there any questions?